Qualitative data would consist primarily of things like interview transcripts, photographs even, artifacts, documents. The primary difference between qualitative and quantitative data is that qualitative data is experiential and it's collected from participants by a researcher. So unlike in a quantitative study where you have a model or you're running a certain mathematical model to come up with a regression or whatever, in a qualitative study, you are actually looking for people to express their lived experiences. So quantitative data is good at dichotomous sort of outcomes. So is this intervention having a certain effect? That's pretty easy to do with a quantitative study. In qualitative studies, you're really looking at the more lived experiences of the participants. That becomes important. So let's suppose there's an intervention that has good outcomes. We've looked at the quant data. We know that it's generally a good thing. Looking at the qualitative data will help us understand what are the experiences of people who actually went through that process. What parts of it are working really well? What parts are challenging? Instead of just a sort of solitary sort of variable that says, yes, it's good, or no, it's not good. You get more of a variance and more of an understanding of what's happening moment by moment. And you can also ask things about sort of what brought the participants to this particular experience, what happened after the experience. It's much more, I think, fully encompassing. So you get to know the people behind the numbers. And I think a lot of folks want to say, well, quant studies are the way to go or qual studies are the way to go. It's really combining both, I think, is the way you want to do it, because a quant study will give you pretty good understanding of what the outcome is. But then the qual data will tell you why it is the way it is. There's a problem or issue or connection or correlation between performance and attendance. So now with a qualitative approach, what you could do is go and ask students about, what are the things that are causing the absences to happen? What happens to you when you're absent from school when you come back to class? And then they might tell you, well, I feel lost. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what the content was before, and I'm sort of behind on things. And you start sort of figuring out what the stories could actually be. Qualitative research sort of presumes that there is not one unified reality. So each student's going to have a different perspective. And they might sort of come together in some cohesive sort of understanding. Okay, something is going on. It has to do with a lack of understanding when they're absent from class. You can use it in combination with the qualitative data to sort of get at the why of why students are not having more positive outcomes and what they are attributing these issues to, whether it's a lack of sleep or it's a lack of interest or just a general feeling of being lost, or maybe just the fact they don't feel that they're as invested because they're not there. In the field, we call that sometimes free writing, and you just ask people to sort of stop what you're doing, just give us a reflection of what's going on with you. And so what you can do is take that data and start chunking it, right? Look for chunks that have common themes. So perhaps when people are saying, I'm confused about, remainders, if we're doing division or something like that. If you see that happening in quantity, then that helps you to understand that that's something that people are struggling with, right? I think it matters. The most important thing I might say would be along the lines of who you are matters. The questions you ask matter. And if you don't have rapport with your students, you're not going to get good data. So it's really important to establish a sense of community in a classroom where students feel they can share their perspectives without being penalized in some way. The experienced qualitative researcher really knows how to draw in a subject. So it's a conversation typically, mostly led by the person who's responding, of course, but part of the role of the qualitative researcher is to be the actual research instrument. So it's your job as a qualitative researcher to go into the field and talk to people and have them respond to you with the answers you want to obtain. A pretty common sort of response from qualitative novices is like, okay, I did an interview, I don't know what happened, I might have talked too much, I'm not sure, and that happens. And I think the more you do it, the better you get at it. So it's not a one-off kind of thing. You have to keep on going back into the field, which would be your classroom, I suppose, and honing your craft and finding out what works well and what time of day is the best time to ask questions. Maybe it's not right before lunch. Maybe it's after lunch. I don't know. So those are the kinds of things you will detect. And I think when somebody is conducting qualitative research, you know yourself much better. And that's something that's really important because you're the instrument. You're the researching tool. So you have to be adept at sort of moving questions forward, asking probes when somebody's responding. You're like, that's not what I wanted to hear. I wanted to know more about this. Or you made an interesting comment there. Can we hear more about that? Finding out those things. So it's like being like Phil Donahue or Oprah in some respects, right? Being a really good interviewer is what that's about. So a lot of this job is pretty fun, I think. So what we do in a classroom example, I would say, is just that, be mindful of not identifying students individually. When you sort of use the data, you can explain to students that I'm using the data in aggregate. So this is what a number of students said, and not necessarily singling out people and, Bill, you said this. Well, you simply say some participants said this was an outcome. And I say participants, that's very clinical. So maybe you say some students said whatever, and some students have this perspective. Certainly it's important not to take the data and move it beyond the classroom purposes unless you've gotten permission to do that. And if that's the case, I would certainly advocate that you talk to somebody in the faculty, a university researcher, about how to use your data outside of the classroom setting to make sure that your students are protected. Because one of the most important things about conducting research, qualitative or quantitative, is not harming your participants. And you might say, well, I'm not drawing blood from people or poking their skin. It doesn't really matter. There's other ways you can harm people by disclosing confidential issues and so forth. It's also helpful to tell the students what you're using the data for. So if you're using it simply for a class discussion, great. But if you're using it for a class discussion and then probably talking to other teachers about it, they should know that, because that will change how they approach the discussion. And you want to make sure that people feel comfortable and trust what's happening. We use that term trustworthiness a lot in qualitative research, and the minute that you don't have trustworthiness with your participants is the minute that you've lost the ability to do this research effectively.